The speed of a car is noted every hour for 2 hours. We have a table here which consists of times 0, 1, and 2, and these are all in hours, and then a speed in miles per hour, and at 0 hours the speed is 0 miles per hour. After 1 hour the speed is 55 miles per hour, and after 2 hours the speed is 75 miles per hour. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this data and I'm going to estimate the total distance traveled over this period. So let's go ahead and talk about what's going to happen over the first hour. Over the first hour, I start from a speed of 0 miles per hour at time t equals 0, and after 1 hour, the speed is now 55 miles per hour. In between 0 and 1, we're assuming that we're going to have some other values here for miles per hour, but those aren't known right now. So over the first hour, the distance traveled, if I'm going 55 miles per hour for that entire hour, well, 55 miles per hour for 1 hour means I'm going to travel 55 miles. So I could travel as much as 55 miles if I had done 55 miles per hour for the entire hour. In fact, I probably didn't do that because I started out at 0 and probably ramped up to 55. I could have traveled as little as 0 miles if I assumed that I went 0 miles per hour for the entire 1 hour, and then at the very end of that interval, I ramped it up instantaneously to 55 miles per hour. In that case, 0 miles per hour for 1 hour would take me 0 miles. So over the first hour, I could have traveled as far as 55 miles or as little as 0 miles, depending on what I take as my estimate for the speed over the first hour. One of the things to notice here is I'm taking miles per hour and I'm multiplying it by hours, and what that gives me is miles. So I'm taking the rate times hours, and that gives me the miles. Now let's take a look at the second hour. During the second hour, if I assume that I did 75 miles per hour for the entire hour, remember, because I'm going from 55 to 75, if I assume I did 75 for the entire hour, well then 75 miles per hour for 1 hour would take me 75 miles. If I assume that I did 55 miles per hour for that entire hour, well then 55 miles per hour times 1 hour is 55 miles. Depending on what I assume about this hour, I could go as far as 75 miles or as little as 55 miles. It all depends on what happens over that hour. And normally what I do is I either assume the lower speed for the entire hour or the upper speed for the entire hour. In reality, we're probably going to have something between 55 and 75. So if I make an estimate of the total distance traveled over this time, remember in one case I did 55 miles per hour for 1 hour and then 75 miles per hour for 1 hour, well that would give me a total of 130 miles traveled. If I assume that for the first hour I went 0 miles per hour for 1 hour and then 55 miles per hour for the second hour, that would give me an estimate of 55 miles. In reality, it's going to probably be something in between this. Notice that in this first estimate up here, we're using the higher speeds from each hour, and so we got a higher value. We got an overestimate of the total distance traveled. When we did this other estimate here, we used 0 and 55. That was the lower speeds from each hour, and that gave us an underestimate of the total distance traveled. These estimates differ by 130 miles minus 55 miles, or 75 miles. To get a better estimate of the total distance traveled, we'd need more data. Perhaps instead of at hour intervals, we'd give it at half-hour intervals. So I've gone ahead and added some more data here. So at time t equals 0, the velocity is 0. At t equals 1, it's 55. T equals 2, 75. That's exactly what we had before. But now I've gone ahead and said that after a half hour, or at t equals 0.5, the speed was 50 miles per hour, and at t equals 1.5, the speed was 65. Now let's go ahead and make those estimates again. Now, if I make an underestimate over each of the intervals here, if I'm doing an underestimate, I need to pick the lower speed. So from 0 to 0.5, I have a choice of picking 0 miles per hour or 50 miles per hour for that interval. So I go ahead and I choose 0. When I'm going from 0.5 to 1 hour, I have a choice of 50 or 55. Since I want an underestimate, I go ahead and I pick 50. From 1 to 1.5, I have a choice of either 55 miles per hour or 65 miles per hour. I go ahead and I'm going to pick 55. And then over the last interval from 1.5 to 2, I have a choice of either 65 or 75, and I'm going to go ahead and pick 65. So in each one of these intervals, I go ahead and take my miles per hour, but now I multiply it by 0.5 hours. So I'm still getting an estimate of miles, but it's how many miles I've traveled over each one of the half-hour sections. When I sum these all together, I now get an estimate of 85 miles. If I make an overestimate, now I'm going to pick the higher speed from each interval. So I'm going to take 50 for a half hour because I had my choice of 0 and 50. I'm going to choose an estimate of 55 over the second half hour. So 0.5 times 55. And over the next half hour, I'm going to choose 65 for a half hour. And then for the last half hour, I'm going to choose an estimate of the speed of 75 miles per hour for a half hour. When I add all of that up, I now get that the estimate is 122.5 miles. Because I've been picking the higher speeds from each interval, this is an overestimate of the total distance traveled. With the additional data, you'll notice now that our estimates differ by 122.5 miles minus 85 miles, or 37.5 miles. So the two estimates got closer together. So when our sum that we've just worked out had two terms, there was a 75-mile difference. When we had four terms, with the data being located at half-hour intervals, now there was a 37.5-mile difference. What we want to know is, as we get more and more terms, what's going to be the difference between our overestimate and our underestimate? And I think what you'll notice here is when I double the number of terms, it halved the difference between the estimates. So if I continue to add more and more terms, that means I need more and more data here. My estimates are going to get closer and closer together.